Justice is one of the most common moral concepts in human history. But what is justice? How do we know how to be just or to act justly? What does a just society look like? What sorts of actions and policies are unjust versus just? In this video series, we're going to focus on some of these questions in an attempt to better understand the concept of justice. One of the main sources we're going to use in this video series is Michael Sandel's book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? You can find a link to this book in the description below. At least the early videos in this series will roughly correspond to a chapter from that book. But I'll also draw on other sources, and I'll be sure to include those sources in the description for each video. In this first episode, we want to do a few things. First, we want to offer a brief definition of justice. Second, we want to note some important distinctions that philosophers make when they discuss justice. Third, we want to take a very brief look at historical notions of justice to help us understand how the idea has developed over time. Finally, we want to offer a brief categorization of modern approaches to justice. And it's here that we're really going to focus on chapter 1 of Sandel's book. If you look at a textbook on justice, you're likely to find the following definition. Justice refers to the principle of giving people what they deserve, what they are owed, or what they're due. That definition is simple enough, and actually, most philosophers agree on it. All right, Carl, I guess we're done. I can just get out of here a little early, maybe go get some sushi or something? No? We still have more to say? Okay. The problem isn't necessarily with this basic definition of justice, but how we specify this definition and apply it. A few questions help highlight this point. What is it that people deserve? How do we decide who deserves what? Who is included in the concept of justice? Who is responsible for ensuring that people actually get what they deserve? These are the types of questions that create sharp divisions among philosophers. As a result, there are many different theories or approaches to justice on the table. It might be helpful to begin our discussion on justice by noting a few important distinctions that philosophers make when discussing the term. To be clear, this list is not exhaustive, it's just a start. Distinction 1. Objective justice versus subjective justice. Slavery has existed, at least in some form, for a majority of human history. Today, people tend to accept that slavery is morally wrong, that it's unjust. But this raises an interesting question. Do we think that slavery is objectively unjust? Or do we think that the idea that slavery is unjust is just a mere matter of public opinion? Think of it this way. Is the claim slavery is unjust closer to the claim 2 + 2 = 4, or closer to the claim blue is the best color? If you think that the claim slavery is unjust is closer to the claim 2 + 2 = 4, you're tending toward an objective understanding of justice. That is, it's true for all people in all times. But if you think the claim slavery is unjust is closer to the claim blue is the best color, then you're tending more toward a subjective understanding of justice. It's really a matter of opinion, whether an individual's opinion or a group or society's opinion. A second tension that exists is justice as a moral ideal versus justice as a legal reality. If we accept the claim that justice is objective, then we should be able to begin to delineate what we think a society ought to look like. But it could be that the law that a society adopts doesn't cohere with what is objectively just. In this case, there would be a difference between that which is just and that which is legal. For example, in the United States, slavery was legal, at least in some states, for a very long time. But if we think these laws violated what people were due or what people deserved, in this case the slaves, then we're acknowledging two things. First, there is something akin to objective justice. Second, at least in some states, US law fell short of that objective ideal by permitting slavery. This point raises another issue. If a particular law permits someone to do something that is unjust, is it right for us to punish that person for following that law? One extreme case study here is Nazi Germany. At the Nuremberg trials, German citizens who engaged in crimes against humanity by performing harsh experiments on Jews were put on trial for their actions. One defense that some of the Nazis offered in justification of their actions was, we were just doing what we were told. We were following orders. In other words, they argued that they were acting in line with legal authorities. Despite this defense, the Nazis were found culpable for their actions. They were found guilty. The Nuremberg trials were a significant step in the establishment of international law. They furthermore led the United Nations, an institution that was formed in 1945, to make its Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. In other words, in the wake of World War II, there was a greater emphasis on the individual rights of all human beings. This was coupled with the idea that if a society adopted laws that violated these rights, that society and its members could be held accountable for doing so. Two things stand out here. First, this suggests that there is an objective form of justice. Second, it also suggests that when people violate some of the basic standards of this objective form of justice, they should be held accountable whether the violations they committed were legal or not. A third distinction that exists is the difference between corrective justice and distributive justice. Corrective justice refers to the attempt to right a wrong, oftentimes by punishing the wrongdoer and somehow compensating the victim. In this sense, corrective justice is a response to a violation of justice. It seeks to give both the wrongdoer and the victim their due in the wake of the wrongdoing. For some, when it comes to the wrongdoer, punishment is sufficient for justice. For others, the goal isn't simply to punish wrongdoers, but rather to restore them to good standing in society. And here we might distinguish between punitive justice and restorative justice. In the United States, one of the most pressing questions for corrective justice addresses reparations in the wake of slavery and abuses of Native Americans. Distributive justice refers to giving each their due, either because it's stipulated by a contract, or simply because they are persons, and all persons are due certain things. Examples of the latter case might include a right to food, a right to potable water, a right to shelter, a right to education, or even a right to health care. One major debate in the United States today is what goods should be distributed to all people simply because they are persons. Another debate is how to distribute goods that are scarce. For example, how to allocate organs to people who need organ transplants. In many cases, these discussions address whether or not distribution of goods should be based on the merit of individuals, the need of individuals, or whether or not such goods should be distributed equally among all individuals. To be clear, there are other distinctions that are common, but for right now, the ones we've addressed are sufficient for us to move forward. Let's turn now to a brief consideration of the historical development of the idea of justice. The goal here is to provide at least a brief overview of one major shift in the idea of justice historically. Obviously, we're going to be leaving a lot out. Today, when people hear the word justice, they may think of a couple different things. Social justice, the law or the justice system, equality, freedom, and so on. But philosopher David Johnston notes that for much of human history, justice dealt with two primary concerns. First, how to punish people who violate the law, and second, the establishment of a good hierarchical society. That is, a society of unequals where people treated each other properly according to their status. Two examples help make this point. The first is the Code of Hammurabi. No, Carl, not the ape. That was Harambe. Yes, Carl, it was tragic. No, I will not hold you until the pain subsides. Anyway, the Code of Hammurabi, which was a Babylonian law from around 3000 BCE, envisions a society of unequals, including an elite class, a class of free people, and a class of slaves. Women had some rights, but had less than men. In the Code of Hammurabi, these inequalities are accepted as part of a just society. The Code of Hammurabi also focused on punishment for those who violated the law. And in line with that hierarchical society, the punishment was dependent upon who broke the law and who they violated by breaking the law. For example, if a free person somehow puts out the eyes of another free person, they must have their own eye put out. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, so on and so forth.
Then we'll put out his eyes and make him crawl.
That was supposed to be Gollum from the Lord of the Rings, End of the Two Towers. Yeah, Carl, it did suck. Okay, thanks, I know that. But if a free person puts out the eye of a slave, they only have to pay a minor fine. Another example is the Mosaic Law from the Hebrew Scriptures. A lot of people limit this to the Ten Commandments, but the law is actually much more substantial than that. Like the Code of Hammurabi, the Mosaic Law accepts an unequal society as a just society. For example, the law accepts the practice of slavery, but does offer slaves some rights. Women had less rights than men. For example, a male slave was to be released after 6 years of service, but a female slave was not released after 6 years of service. Furthermore, Israelites had more rights than foreigners who were part of the community. Like the Code of Hammurabi, the Mosaic Law often focuses on punishments for those who violate the law. For example, those who physically harm or curse their parents are to be put to death, and punishments were less harsh if the person you wronged was a slave versus if they were a non-slave, and that's in part because slaves were considered the property of Israelites. One more point about the Code of Hammurabi and the Mosaic Law is worth noting. While both legal codes accepted that an unequal society was still a just society, neither code embraced the idea that the powerful could take advantage of the weak or the vulnerable. The Code of Hammurabi explicitly states that the powerful have a responsibility to care for those who are weaker. The Mosaic Law makes a similar claim. Both legal codes claim that people have a responsibility to care for widows and orphans, which was shorthand for marginalized people. In the Hebrew Scriptures, God requires the well-off to care for and protect the poor and the marginalized. In other words, the poor and the marginalized are due protections and provisions from the powerful. However, it's important to note that these claims do not suggest that either the Code of Hammurabi or the Mosaic Law thought that the inequalities that existed in society were unjust. It just suggested that the inequality should look a particular way. The idea that people had unequal statuses and were due different things was readily accepted. This embrace of inequality might seem odd to us today. It doesn't square well with the concept of human rights or the belief that all people are created equal, ideas that stem from the Enlightenment but were made more pressingly clear in the wake of World War II. But it's worth mentioning that many of the men who affirmed the idea that all people were created equal owned slaves. denied women the right to vote, and empowered white landowners over white men who didn't own land. Indeed, in the United States, blacks were slaves for longer than they've been free. And even after the 13th Amendment, blacks did not have an uncontested universal right to vote until 1870. And for 100 years after that, voter restriction laws still hindered their access to the polls. And there is debate that such laws are still enforced today. Legal segregation, based on the rather dubious idea of separate but equal, perpetuated racial inequalities until 1954. But segregation continued in the South long after that. Of course, another example of legalized inequality is the fact that women did not have the right to vote until 1920. The point that I'm trying to make here is that even though the idea that all people are created equal was an ideal of the Declaration of Independence, an embrace of an unequal society was explicitly entrenched in US law until rather recently. And there's notable evidence that such inequality is not simply a thing of the past. We'll get to that. Thankfully, this long-standing view of embracing an unequal society as a just society has shifted considerably. But questions about what makes a society just or unjust continue to persist. For example, bans on same-sex marriage were not declared unconstitutional until the year 2015. This brief historical exploration suggests that for the majority of human history, inequality was accepted as part of a just society, although certainly not by all members of that society. This long-standing historical precedent raises the question, does justice require that all persons be treated equally? And that raises other questions. Who counts as a person? What about prenatal life? What about non-human animals? And why might we consider these forms of life persons or non-persons? Furthermore, if people are equals, what are they due as equals? In the US today, one of the most fundamental political debates that occurs is whether or not healthcare is a universal right. Is healthcare mandated by justice? And what about the issue of punishment? Are jails just? What about the conditions in jails? What are prisoners due as a matter of justice? Merely punishment or the promise of restoration? The list of questions goes on, but in order to understand how people answer these questions differently, it might be helpful to provide some categorization of approaches to justice in contemporary philosophy. Michael Sandel suggests that there are three dominant approaches to justice. These three categories are similar to the categories of normative ethics that I shared in my video, A Brief Intro to Normative Ethics, but there's also some notable differences. So let's explore. The first category focuses on welfare. In this view, justice is measured by the welfare produced by actions, policies, and laws for individual people or groups. Sandel will focus on utilitarianism as the primary example of this category. The second category is liberty. In this view, justice is measured by securing and protecting the liberty of individuals. But as Sandel notes, subgroups within this category are often in bitter debates with one another. Why? Well, one reason is there's some disagreement about what liberty or freedom means. In one sense, we might think of liberty as the right of an individual to make decisions unhindered by other entities, for example, the government. This definition of liberty tends to be at work in libertarianism. In another sense, we might think of liberty as people having fair or equal access to opportunities to pursue their goals. This definition of liberty tends to be at work in more progressive forms of American politics. The third category is virtue. Here, justice is measured not merely by the outcomes of individual actions or the securing of liberty for individuals, but rather by the attempt to build good characters in people. The question here is not simply, how does a society ensure that people act rightly or have the ability to act freely? But rather, how does a society shape its individual members into good people? The upcoming videos in this series will explore these different approaches to justice in more detail. Okay, in this video, we explored the basic definition of justice. We noted that even though there is general agreement on this basic definition of justice, there's a lot of differences in the way that people specify the definition. To help us understand these differences, we considered some common distinctions that philosophers make when discussing justice. We briefly looked at some historical considerations to get a basic shape of the development of justice over time. And finally, we introduced Sandel's three categories of different approaches to justice. In the next episode, we're going to explore the approach of utilitarianism. Until then, farewell.